What's happening, friends? Great to have you here. Welcome to Syracuse Sports and our Syracuse football post-game show presented by Kraus Health. For those of you that have been listening to Syracuse Sports, Spotify, Apple, Amazon, wherever you get your podcast, maybe watching on YouTube, the feedback's been incredible. We appreciate you guys being a part of the podcast, but this is an extension of the podcast. With the football season here, we are going to do a post-game podcast for you after every Syracuse football game into basketball season and beyond. So we're excited about that. Let me remind you that you can get your voice heard on this at 315-552-1964. That's our voicemail line, okay? 315-552-1964. Put that number in your phone and you can fire off some voicemails anytime. I'd love to make the voicemails part of the post-game show here as well. Really not much to talk about after Syracuse's opener against Colgate. A 65-0 drubbing over the Raiders. The biggest point total in the Dino Babers era. His first ever game as Syracuse head coach was against Colgate in 2016, and here in the season opener for 2023. I mean, things went according to script, as we'll talk about here, and Emily Leiker, my colleague from syracuse.com, is going to join us a little bit later on here, and we'll go over some of the real things we saw from this game and Syracuse's win over Colgate. But it's really hard to tell in some cases, right? What's real and what's not. So that's my question. Like, what are the real takeaways from a win over Colgate, a clearly overmatched team? And there have been some FCS opponents that have given Syracuse fits over the years. You know, Dino Babers, and sometimes you don't know if this is coach speak or not. Dino, to his credit, tends to be pretty more honest in some of these things than the typical coach speak you hear sometimes. But to say he was losing sleep about Colgate, I think he was speaking generally about some of these games that he's coached in and has been a part of. But this Colgate team came out and was a nightmare, frankly. And it's nothing against our friends at Colgate. I hope they go on to have a great season. But, man, they were just so overmatched in this game. And you really wonder, like, what does Syracuse get out of something like this? Look, you don't have preseason football in college football. Maybe it's a good thing that Syracuse had this game based on a couple of things we're going to talk about before the schedule ramps up. And look, every season's different, but where the script is the same for Syracuse football is look at the schedule last year. They took care of business early. They banked a bowl game at the midpoint of the season. There are 4 winnable games in the first 4 games of the season. There's no way around it. You check-marked Colgate. Western Michigan has got to be a win. Purdue, look, you're on the road, Big Ten team. Weird stuff happens, but they've got a new coach. They lost Aiden O'Connell, their terrific quarterback. That's a beatable team for Syracuse. So after that, it's Army, and Army always plays hard, and they come in, and they're disciplined, and they might give Syracuse some fits in certain ways, but man, that is just 4-0. And I know in sports you can't write these things down. That's why you play the games and all the cliches in the world that we could talk about here, but you got to win those 4 games. And Colgate, I asked Dino Babers about this, as a matter of fact, after the game. Just think of the contrast between the opening of this year and the opening of last year. The hype and the buildup, Louisville, Friday night, ACC game, right out of the gate, and no pun intended, Colgate. And it just set a tone. And I feel like that game was such a launch pad for Syracuse and the confidence it gained, the monkey that was off their back after one game last year, and the surge that came from that. You don't get any kind of momentum in the same way against Colgate, right? Because it's just an overmatched football team that you should have beat with your eyes closed out there. So what are some of the real takeaways from this matchup? Here are a few from me. One is the offensive line is still adjusting. Now, Emily and I are going to talk about this a little bit later on in the podcast. They had an unexpected player out of the lineup at the offensive line. So right there from game 1, you're making an adjustment. You got 3 new starters on that offensive line. The right side in particular of the line, you go from center to right guard to right tackle. You've got some new faces in there. And right in game 1, they're making an adjustment. Garrett Schrader went through training camp on a pitch count. Garrett Schrader did not participate in spring ball. They're still making up reps there. Okay, now Schrader indicated all along, Dino indicated all along he was fine. He was in a lot of the drills that mattered. He played in all the scrimmages. They did hold him out of some drills that we got to watch during training camp on that pitch count, which made sense because you don't want to, exert a guy that's coming back from surgery. Okay. But there was a little bit more of a pass rush in this game on Garrett Schrader than there should have been from an overmatched Colgate defense, which shows a Syracuse offensive line that's still adjusting, that is still acclimating, that it's from left to right, still is not completely in sync. Now, all the players, with the exception of Dave Lullabaugh, who transferred in, most of these offensive linemen at least were around. They got reps last year. Enrique Cruz steps into a starting role. He was a part of this thing last year. You had Chris Bleich, who had a penalty in this game. Penalties are an issue, as we're going to get to with this team, but he's back. You have Kalen Ellis, unfortunately, didn't suit up in this game, which was part of the adjustment there, but there's a familiar name. And there are guys that got on the field last year that are on this offensive line. But from left to right, it's still something that is an adjustment, right? They're adjusting to their quarterback. They're adjusting to a new coach who came in. Steve Farmer is now the coach of the offensive line. So I saw some adjustment. And frankly, I feel like it's a good thing they didn't play Louisville. Not specific to Louisville. I'm talking about it's a good thing they did not have a hyped Friday night league opponent in game one, because there were some pass rush issues in this game that frankly shouldn't have been there. It wasn't just a few times. Garrett Schrader was scrambling more than he should have been, and it wasn't Garrett's timing was off and he was taking off and running when he shouldn't have. No, he was forced out of the pocket at times. He threw an interception with 11 seconds to go in the second quarter, just before halftime, and he was on his back after that. He was sacked in this game, which I wouldn't expect. The Wagner game last year, he was 17 for 17, and he was out of there before you could say 17 for 17. So look, Garrett Schrader was terrific in this game. 18 of 24, 257 yards, 3 touchdowns. Showed a lot of the flashes that make Garrett Schrader great. I just felt like there was a little too much pass rush for Colgate, but I think a lot of that has to do with this is an offensive line still adjusting. So I'd be curious to see how that goes from week 1 to week 2, because essentially Western Michigan next week is going to be your season opener, because I just think Colgate is empty calories in so many ways. I just don't know what the real takeaways are there, but that was real. And Syracuse got a little taste of the pass rush. Jason Beck's up in the booth now. Remember, this was his first game as offensive coordinator, and he's running what I would imagine was a pretty vanilla offense. Why put some stuff out there, even for Western Michigan next week that you don't have to? Against Colgate, you can run as basic an offense as it comes and beat that team, and they did. But that was something to me. I think there's some dudes at wide receiver. Omari Hatcher in particular broke out, had 2 catches over 40 yards. We've talked certainly a lot about Aronde Gatson, who just, vacuums up so much attention when it comes to the wide receiver position on this team. And look, Gatson got open. He only had 57 yards and 6 catches in this game. There was a couple of overthrows from Schrader, and look, every team's just going to throw everything they have at Gatson, so it's going to be a little harder for him to get open, but it's not like he wasn't open, and this was a game where it's like, use your dudes, use everybody. 6 different receivers caught a touchdown for Syracuse in this game. You didn't need Gatson to be that guy, but he's fine. Right? That's a guy that's just getting open and is one of the best players at his position, not only in the ACC, but really in the country, and I'm going to enjoy seeing Gatson try and fill out that role this year. Alford caught a touchdown, didn't have any huge plays, a nice throw in the corner of the end zone that he got. He's fine. He's the clear number 2, I think, on this team. But to see Hatcher come in, play with a little bit of attitude, it was interesting to hear Dino Baber say after the game that he feels like Hatcher's coming along as a player because he cleaned up his nightlife. There's more to the story there, right? That he kind of cleaned up some things happening off the field, a little more focused, but that's a guy that I think can get open against Colgate. I think he can get open against Clemson. I'm encouraged to see that we talk so much about who's number 2. Well, there could be a legit 3. That to me was real out of this game. Here's something that's unfortunate that was real: penalties. It's something that has to be scrutinized a lot for Syracuse this year, because look, they were the most penalized team in college football last year. And I understand you got to give a little bit of slack because it's game one, but there were 4 penalties in the first quarter. Dino was really upset on the sideline. There was a special teams penalty in particular that gave Colgate the ball back. Colgate was lined up to punt, and you just hand them an offsides penalty. Boom. They get the ball back. Okay, against Colgate, you can get away with that. Against Clemson, that could cost you the game. If you give Clemson 1 extra possession, if you give Pittsburgh 1 extra possession, if you give, there's always going to be a game or two where just nothing's going right. You're turning the ball over. Things are wacky, right? You can't make mistakes like that on special teams. Uncle Brent says it all the time. Hashtag special teams matter, right? So they've got to work out the kinks on that. So they did slow that pace down. They only, air quotes, ended up with 7 penalties in the game, but penalties have got to be cleaned up. We mentioned Bleich had the offsides. There's just too many. I'm just going to say there's just too many dumb penalties that this team commits that you will not get away with against better teams. So I think that's real. That's an issue they have to continue to focus on and clean up. And Dino was pretty fired up about it at the post-game press conference when Emily asked him about it. And we'll talk to Emily about that coming up in just a minute. It's tough to tell with the defense. I mean, early in the game, Marlowe Wax just flies right through, sacks the Colgate quarterback, sets the tone for the rest of the day. You know, Colgate only had 106 total yards. They had 7 first downs. They crossed the 50-yard line once, and that was late in the game, right? I love Elijah Clark and what he brings to the table. He had 7 tackles. Man, my heart was in my throat a little bit when he was down early in the first quarter because I have picked this guy to be like one of the breakout studs on the defense this year. I picked him to go over 3 interceptions in our Syracuse football preview show, the 23 and 23, which I hope you got a chance to listen to. And I think he's an important part of a secondary and a defense that's replacing some guys back there. You know, Jeremiah Wilson had a pick 6. I think he could be a solid cornerback on this team. But again, it's tough to tell. You know, the dudes stand out no matter who you play against. The Marlowe Axes of the world. Caleb Okechukwu actually had a pretty quiet game. And, you know, Derek McDonald was back out there. It's good to see Stephon Thompson back out there for this team. But I think we're going to learn a lot more about that when Syracuse plays Western Michigan. I'm just not sure what you learn against a heavily overmatched Colgate offense in that department. You had 2 new kickers out there. I think Brady Denenberg, by all accounts, has been solid so far. We didn't really see him kick any extended field goals. He booted in a 25-yarder. His extra points were fine. There was 1 mixed extra point, not his fault, though. It was a botched snap, and he didn't even get a chance to attempt it. Jack Stonehouse only had to punt once. Special teams, how about DeMarcus Adams, who had a really cool run back? Remember, Trevor Pena is also a primary kick returner on this team. He was not in this game. Think of, you had 6 different receivers catch a touchdown in this game, and Pena didn't even play. And Pena, I think, would be on that list had he played in this game. We'll see what his status is going ahead for week 2. By the way, that's another great thing that came out of week 1. No major injuries. We mentioned Clark walked off the field, but he was back in a couple possessions later, and Syracuse didn't have any major boo-boos, owies, injuries, or anything of note that we saw, other than what we learned about before the game and the change in the offensive line, as we'll talk about with Emily coming up here shortly. So, look, all told, they checked the box, no major injuries, you lived up to the script, you got to go out there and play real football. Kind of, for like a half. But there should have been a running clock in this game, right? There should have been a running clock, maybe not even play the fourth quarter. Dino should have went over to the Colgate sideline after the third quarter, like, guys, can we just call this a day? And you want to get your young guys in there and all that stuff. I'm being half facetious in that case. But it's good that we're sitting here talking on a post-game show after this game that there were no major surprises. Everything went according to plan. And as they said on the A-Team, I love it when a plan comes together. Let's see what Emily Leiker thinks. My friend and colleague from syracuse.com will get her real perspectives on Syracuse's 65-0 win over Colgate coming up. Let's bring her in. Emily Leiker, syracuse.com. Emily, we finally saw some real football at the JMA Wireless Dome on Saturday afternoon. Or did we? Right? Like, I saw a football team in front of me that put up 65 points, and I saw another team that remembered to show up on time, and that's pretty much it. So what do you think we really could take away from this 65-0 win over Colgate for Syracuse?
I think I think this confirmed that this is a solid Syracuse team. Like, we didn't see anything glaring that like stuck out. Like, yes, it's an FCS opponent. Yes, it's Colgate, but like down to the third and fourth stringers, like there was still action happening. Sometimes you get these games against FCS opponents, and by the time the starters and the backups are off the field, you get to the third string and like there aren't touchdowns and everything just kind of stalls out. And action kept on going pretty much until that last 7 minutes when there wasn't much and everyone started leaving the dome and people started tuning out. But I think this did show that there is some depth to this team. Now, how much depth there is when you get into games against opponents that are actually in the ACC or our FBS opponents, maybe we still have to see that. But I think just this was like a good baseline assessment of like where this team is into the third and fourth stringers.
The offensive line was the thing that jumped out to me. And I think this would have been something to watch if it was Colgate, if it was like last year when they opened up with Louisville. You've got 3 new starters on there. And then it was a bit of a surprise, Emily, that you had a couple of guys out on this offensive line that we expected to be in. So I think no matter who was out there, and this is, I think, a real takeaway from this game, it's just going to take a little time for the offensive line to adjust. Garrett Schrader was on a pitch count throughout camp, and I know he's insisted throughout he's fine. But when you're just not in that normal rhythm as a quarterback, I mean, he did all the big drills that we watched at camp. He played in all the scrimmages, but there's still an adjustment period here, and I think we saw that on Saturday. I mean, Colgate did manage to get some pass rush on the first team offense when Garrett Schrader was the quarterback. So I think that's a real takeaway. And I'm trying to find the happy medium there of how much of that was just first game, all that stuff. And this is just an offensive line that's still in flux a little bit.
Yeah, and I mean, let's go ahead and point out who those people were that were missing. It was first stringer on the depth chart, right guard, Joe Moore, who Dino told us after the game sprained his ankle in camp this week. He said that they're hoping he'll be back either next week or the week after, so that's either against Western Michigan or against Purdue. We haven't seen Joe play at all. He's a transfer from Richmond, so we'll still be waiting, I guess, for his kind of FBS debut. And then the other guy was backup left guard Kalen Ellis, who has been a starter for Syracuse in the past, but he's been in and out of a walking boot all fall camp. It's kind of unclear, like, what type of issue that is and how serious it is, but both of those guys were in street clothes, and so the O-line. Look, that's why they cross-train the way they do, and Dino loves to talk about that. He's like, we find the top 5 to 7 guys, and then we switch them around all over the field and have them do everything, and that's why they do that, so that if someone's out at the last minute, they're like, okay, well, we know this guy's a good left tackle, but he's also an okay right guard, and we can move him over if we need to.
Another real takeaway, I think, Emily, is LaQuint Allen. I think this kid's good. I think he's ready to step into this number 1 role. He's got such a lofty guy to live up to in Sean Tucker. Now, some of that was probably Colgate, but the breakaway speed, the ability to – I love his footwork. I just feel like this is a guy that can hold down this position. And, you want him to get off on a good start if you're Syracuse. 107 yards, ripped off a 35-yard run, got in the end zone. Like, you couldn't ask. Think about, he has to step in as the number 1 guy in the Pinstripe Bowl and has a terrific Pinstripe Bowl. He goes through the offseason that he had, which is well documented at this point. He comes into camp a little bit later than you would want him to, but it looks like he's been there all along.
Yeah, I mean, he didn't miss a step. He was right in there right away. I mean, the whole offense kind of stuttered a little on that first drive. We got Jack Stonehouse's debut because of it, though, so who can complain?
And his only kick of the night, by the way.
His only kick of the night, that first drive, 49-yard punt. But, yeah, I mean, Allen looked great, and, of course, after the game, he was like, you know what, I already put everything that's happened to me in the past 6 months behind me, but it felt great, obviously, to go out there and score a touchdown in the Dome. One thing I was surprised about with Allen, and maybe this is just because it's Colgate and they're saving it for later, is he wasn't involved in the receiving game at all, which is something we know they want to do with him and that he's capable of. We saw it last year several times, like honestly, last year we saw more of him receiving, it felt like, than we did really rushing. So he didn't have any catches tonight. I don't even remember seeing him targeted at all. Maybe that's misremembering. I got to go back and watch the film, as
It
Dino
wasn't a
would
ton
say.
if he was, yeah.
No, yeah. So I'm curious to see if that picks up in a couple weeks once they're into conference play and FBS play.
Another real thing, I mean, there's not a lot of negative takeaways from a 65-0 win if you're Syracuse, but they committed 7 penalties. 4 of those penalties came in the first quarter. A couple of them came on special teams. One gave Colgate the ball back. Colgate was lined up to punt. Syracuse is offsides. They get the ball right back. I mean, it didn't end up mattering, as we saw. The Colgate offense was just atrocious in this game, and the Syracuse defense just stomped them. But when you asked Dino about penalties after the game, like, he was pretty fired up and knows, like, look, this is going to be scrutinized. He doesn't get the benefit of the doubt that it's the first game. This was the most penalized team in college football last year, Emily, and it's something that you would think they've got nowhere to go but up, but I think we saw in that first game, there's still a little bit to clean up in the penalty department.
Yeah, I mean, I said that. I was like, you guys were the most penalized team in the country last year, and we kind of saw you get penalized a lot today again. And he agreed with me that was a fact, that they're super penalized last year. So, like, I think it's a little bit of both. It is week 1 and those things happen. But you're right. Like, Dino was he was like, no, I was not pleased with it. And I feel like in the past we've heard him say, like, mental mistakes happen, that type of stuff. And so it felt like a little bit of a different tone on the penalties. And you know what? Maybe that was because a lot of them came from the starting groups. Like, most of the penalties we saw were in the first quarter, early in the second quarter, when veteran guys like Chris Bleish, who had 2 false starts, were on the field and doing these things. And so that, I think, is certainly a different tone or a different level than, oh, it's a true freshman coming in and maybe he jumps the ball a little early and you're like, okay, I get it, first game jitters.
Emily, give me 2 or 3 guys that, keeping with our theme here, that showed real stuff against Colgate. Like, they broke out against Colgate, but they could do it against Clemson. They could do it against good teams as well.
Yamari Hatcher, I think, is top of the list. He's one of these guys that I feel like have heard about for like the past year, and like his name gets mentioned and his teammates talk about him, but we hadn't really seen anything to like super back that up yet. And today backed that up. I mean, he led the team in receiving yards. I gotta look here. He had 105 receiving yards on just 4 catches. He had the game high of a 48-yard reception. I mean, he is a deep threat for opposing defenses. He was great. I think if we are looking at the other side of the ball, obviously Jeremiah Wilson's pick 6 stood out. He didn't do much beyond that if you look at the stat sheet in terms of like tackles or breakups or anything like that. One guy I noticed just from stats and I hadn't really noticed like necessarily in the game was Kevin Jobity Jr., true sophomore, maybe a redshirt sophomore, defensive lineman. He had 6 tackles, which was right there below the top 4 guys on the team who are like Marlo Wax and Justin Barron and these big names. So he led the defensive line in tackles. And I think those are kind of my 3 guys from this game to pay attention to.
Well, the secondary was a position that we were wondering about. You got Deuce Chestnut goes to LSU. You've got Jihad Carter, who goes to Ohio State, and Jeremiah Wilson steps in. You mentioned he had the pick 6, and he looked pretty solid, staying in that secondary. I'm a big Elijah Clark fan. I just feel like he brings a lot to this defense. I know he broke out last year, but I really think he could step in. And, we were talking about who could be breakout guys and doing some of our preseason predictions. Like, I think this guy can pick up some interceptions this year. Today, I kind of had a lump in my throat earlier. I'm like, my breakout guy's getting walked off the field. Thankfully, he was okay. I just like what he brings to the defense. He really stands out to me there. But again, I got to see it against a real defense. I mean, Jeremiah Wilson's pick 6, I mean, that was gift wrapped right to him. And the Colgate quarterback, God bless him, was trying to do like a jump pass. And Jeremiah Wilson's just like, thank you, and runs into the end zone. So I think those are guys to keep an eye on. But let's see when it gets real here in a couple of weeks, right? What are your other big takeaways from a 65-0 win over Colgate that you feel like, okay, these are things that are going to matter a week, 2 weeks, 10 weeks from now?
Yeah, I think it was interesting to see where Schrader picked to go ahead and scramble, and not just where Schrader scrambled, but when the receivers were fighting for yardage too, because last year it felt like Syracuse's offense was really scrappy. Like they were going after every last yard they could get every time they had an opportunity. I mean, we saw that all the time with Garrett Schrader taking these like brutal hits when he was on the run, and everyone would be like, oh my God, don't do that. You're going to get injured. And what happened? He did get injured. So that was interesting to see, just him hit the deck a little quicker, like in a game against Colgate, especially where he could have broken through those tackles and run through those guys probably if he wanted to. So, I have to listen back to exactly what he said post game about it, but he got asked if it was like a coach's decision thing or just something he came to like decide and felt like he was better at. But that was definitely intriguing to me. And I think as much as it helps Syracuse to have Schrader on the run, it helps them more if he stays healthy. And I think minimizing hits when he's on the run does that for sure. That was probably my big thing in terms of like, okay, how is this going to impact things down the line? I think the other thing is just seeing how many wide receivers were truly like able to have big plays and make big catches when it counted, because that was another thing that we had heard all fall was this is a very competitive room. There are a lot of guys who can step up here. Garrett has a good relationship with all of them, and watching them do one-on-ones in practice that just doesn't necessarily prove that to me. It's an entirely different environment. But to see Isaiah Jones go out there and get the catches that he did, to see Damian Alford haul in a few, Aronde Gadsden haul in a few, obviously, I thought that was good to see a little bit of spreading the wealth there.
And while we're on that subject, one thing we didn't see, Emily, is my favorite position. We didn't see Dan Villari. We didn't see David Clement get targeted. And I think that's a lot of let's hold back a little bit here. If I'm Jason Beck, I'm not going to show the Western Michigan and Purdue and Clemson and Army down the road here what I'm doing necessarily at that point. This was a basic vanilla offense. I mean, hey, the fans that came to the Dome and watched on TV, guys, this is what we see at practice. This is just basic stuff, right? But you could do that against Colgate and beat them 65-0. So I'm intrigued to see what we're going to get down the road there. And, Schrader did have one boo-boo we should mention. I forget the guy's name for Colgate off the top of my head, but that is the easiest interception that guy's going to have in his life. I mean, just one of those game one miscommunication. Garrett probably thought someone was going one way, they went the other. He lofts the pass and then immediately regrets that decision. Like Ron Burgundy drinking the milk. Like, oh my God, that's not my receiver. And there you go. So congratulations to our friend from Colgate, who you can always say he intercepted Garrett Schrader, right? If there's one takeaway, you got that.
Yeah, I do think Garrett ended up on his back at the end of that play too, so he might have lofted that ball and really not known where it was going. So
yeah, we'll see.
Look at the film.
This is like week one overreaction, but he was pressured a little bit more than he should have been in this game. That is a big takeaway for me. But again, I want to be fair about the offensive line adjustments in game one and all that fun stuff, right? Well, we had an easy night at the Dome. We'll see what week two brings with Western Michigan visiting next week. Emily, great stuff. Appreciate you hopping on. And we'll keep this going throughout the season here on Syracuse Sports and our Syracuse Football Postgame presented by Krause Health. Enjoy the rest of your Labor Day weekend, and we'll do this again soon.